Boa noite, pessoal. Sejam todos bem-vindos à 25ª edição do nosso Meetup, completando hoje um ano na edição virtual, no formato virtual, devido à pandemia. Muitas coisas ruins acontecendo, mas estamos aqui mais uma vez. Obrigado pela presença de todos. Mais uma vez, uma presença especial, uma presença internacional, a Elina Halonen. A gente vai ter hoje, a apresentação vai ser feita em inglês, todo o Meetup vai ser realizado em inglês. As perguntas podem ser feitas no chat em português, a gente dá um jeitinho de traduzir e ajudar, tá? Quem precisar de ajuda. E agora eu vou passar a palavra para a Flávia, vamos apertar a tecla SAP, vamos para o English now. Então, Flávia...
Great. Pessoal, primeiro só falando um pouquinho da Elina. A Elina ela tem há bastante tempo, inclusive a gente tem aí um capítulo no guia dela. Ela já tem aí desde 2012 um trabalho muito legal acontecendo, né, aplicado. Então, ela é fundadora também de uma Behavior Change Society, uma consultoria chamada Square Peg Site. Então, ela traz essa análise bem crítica, legal, com vários insights. Então, foi esse o motivo da gente... É sempre muito legal ouvir ela falar. E então, por isso a gente pediu aí para ela estar com a gente hoje. Espero que vocês aproveitem. E agora fazendo a tecla SAP direitinho. So, Elina, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, being here with us. As we said, it's a talk, so you have your time for presenting the information, and then we have real chat, yes, and have some questions from the audience. So, guys, Elina is a behavioral science consultant who works on behavior change, cultural insights, and market research projects. She was previously a co-founder of one of the first agencies that made this, I was speaking English, like with the behavioral science and market research industry. And now she runs both her consultancy. So, Square Peg Insights. She's going to talk a little bit more about for us her views and some places that we can learn more behavioral science. So thank you very much, Elina. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I will share. Oh, can you enable screen sharing, please?
Yeah.
Done.
There we go. So yes, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a bit of an odd time. I don't think I've ever given a talk at 11 o'clock at night because I'm actually in Amsterdam. So and I'm also not a native English speaker. So if I'm stuck for words, it's just the time of night. So but let's get going. So I am going to talk about behavioral insights in a multicultural world, and we're just to set your expectations, there's only so much we can cover in half an hour or so it's more of a thought starter and sort of conversation and pointers for you to where you might look for some more ideas and inspiration. So let's see, there we go. Just I'm actually going to hide everyone because that's easier. I know that Flávia introduced me, but there's sort of maybe 3 things that you might be useful to know about me. So I'm originally Finnish, even though I sound like I'm British. I'm not. I just lived there for 15 years, and then for the past 4 years I've lived in the Netherlands. So I sort of tend to live between cultures, and my husband is from Scotland, so I constantly live between different cultures, and I suppose that's why I'm really interested in this stuff. I've worked in this area about 10 years, a practitioner in specifically behavioral insights and behavioral science. And I like to collect master's degrees. Much smarter move would be do a PhD, but that's just not my thing. So I've done, studied marketing and linguistics and then cross-cultural psychology. So really sort of, hovering around this area in different ways. And I do different things. The one that I think Flávia didn't mention is Mind in Context, which is not really a business. It's meant to be a sort of knowledge hub, and I'll tell you more about it at the end. But it's my sort of initiative to talk, really bring culture into applied behavioral science. So this mouse not working. So the reason that we're talking about this today is that psychology is not really representative of humankind. If you read books in this area like behavioral science, or if you read even the papers, Most of them tend to say that people do this and this and this, people do that. Actually, it's not really, we're not talking about people. We're mostly talking about Americans and with a sprinkling of some other nationalities, because most of the research in psychology and what we know about human behavior is based on about 15% of the world's population, mostly North Americans, but also a little bit of Brits and a little bit from the UK and around Europe. And that's really roughly what we know. And the average North American college student is about 300 times more likely to be a participant in a psychology study than anyone else in the world. Sometimes when I mention this, people, I get some resistance. Actually, I just realized I'm speaking really fast, so I'm going to slow down a little bit. Sometimes people comment and say, well, what's the problem? The problem is that if you replaced North Americans with any other nationality, it would likely be considered as some sort of niche research. So we can't really say that people from one country on the entire planet is representative of humankind. About 10 years ago, there was a paper that came out that coined this acronym, WEIRD, which you may have heard, and it stands for Western Educated Samples from Industrialized, Rich, Democratic Countries. And it's kind of, that was 10 years ago when the paper came out, and it's sort of, the paper itself collects a lot of it's a sort of a meta-analysis of different areas of psychology, and it had a lot of rejoiners and lots of commentary. It was quite a big deal in academia back then, but then in the next 10 years, some things have changed, but not very much. I'd say that in the past year, this has become more of a conversation in applied behavioral science as well. Now, there are different views on this, but this is Hazel Marcus. She's a professor of behavioral sciences at Stanford University, and she's a really, really big name in social psychology. I've seen her kind of comment once that on a conference talk that every behavioral economics effect we know is weird. That's her book, just to kind of like, if you want to make a note, and there's a book list at the end as well. I don't know if it's, that's a quite a snappy soundbite, but we'll see whether that is the case. They have mostly been studied and discovered in weird countries, so technically that's probably true. The reason this matters, where the research comes from, is that judgment decision making, which is the discipline behind what we know as behavioral economics, it's almost entirely led by white upper middle class American scientists. If you look up a list of most influential scientists, they're mostly fall into that category. There are some women, but that's pretty much it. And that's quite significant, because science isn't as objective as we like to think it is. It is influenced by the scientist's cultural background and the context that they're working in, because it influences what they choose to study, what assumptions they made, or what they assume that is why something is important or why people are doing something, and so on. It influences how they choose their methods, because they think about, they have some beliefs about what reality is like and how we find out about the reality, like how we gather knowledge. And then also how they interpret and generalize from the findings and all that stuff. A good example of this is how strongly behavioral economics, let's focus on behavioral economics, is focused on individual choice. The reason that is we know so much about it, that there is so much literature, is that individual choice is a really important part of American culture. It's almost like a fundamental right above anything else that you might value. So to be able to exercise choice in everything that you do is really, really crucial to American society and Americans. And the reason I have a picture of bagels is that the day I realized this, I was in San Francisco to visit a friend, and I went to get a coffee and a bagel from a cafe. I counted that I had to make 11 choices before I could get a coffee and some sort of pastry. If a couple of months later, a couple of months before I had been in Italy, if I did the same thing in the morning, I would only make 2 choices. Will I have coffee or not? Or will I have a pastry or not? It's not really, it's not all about customization. So it's quite astounding when you realize how much choice is just emphasized. And so the thing is that if we are what we see and we attend to different things, we focus on different things, then we kind of live in different worlds. This is Joseph Henrich, who is one of the original researchers who coined the term weird. Those are his 2 books. The Secret of Our Success came out a couple of years ago, and The Weirdest People in the World came out in September, and it's really a very interesting read. I would highly recommend that. It's a very theoretical read, but it's good. It will give a good grounding to how we ended up where we are. And so before I sort of dive into more of this, culture is defined in very different ways. The term is used to describe things like youth culture or corporate culture, or it's just used in a lot of different ways. You can refer to things like material objects, or that type of culture, visual culture. But the way that I'm the way I'm using it here is this is my sort of preferred definition. There are lots of different definitions even within psychology, and that tells you something that there is no kind of sort of general agreed definition. But we'll go with this. So if we think of culture as a way that people interpret what goes around them, and they share that with other people that they're sort of surrounded by. It's quite important to not kind of think that culture equals a country or the population of a country, which is kind of where originally researchers like Hofstede would talk about it as a country, because there is a lot of variation within a country as well. Hofstede himself, his work is not very much used in cross-cultural psychology because, and he originally comes from management science. And the problem is that Hofstede's measures are country level averages, or he did that in an organization, but usually you talk about as country level averages. You can't really measure them on the level of an individual. So they don't really work in psychology. They're sometimes referred to, but there isn't really a scale that is directly Hofstede is that. But there are other measures that you can use, but it's not called that. That's not really used, or you shouldn't really use it. We can refer to people that they have a cultural orientation, a general tendency to interpret their environment in a way that's consistent with some sort of dimensional culture. And the reason we have these tendencies is that it's an evolutionary mechanism and makes it easier to work with other people and kind of survive. And so the way we think about ourselves and the way we behave, it comes from, it's a result of sort of being shaped by different influences and our continued experience. So if it's so important, why don't we know about culture? Why is there so little discussion about culture and behavioral economics? The reason is that there is some research. If you look for it, you can find it here and there. But much of the research that exists, it's kind of been sort of, the fancy term is, hi. So did you have a question? No. Okay. All right. I'll leave you up. There hasn't really been this kind of unifying framework to organize the findings and really look at how they relate to each other and kind of give you that you can dip into it and then use that to understand another cultural context. It doesn't exist. to be honest, it doesn't even exist in judgment decision making or behavioral economics. There really isn't one. So it's not surprising we don't have that for culture either. But the three key reasons that we don't have that is that the scientific field has focused on finding so-called main effects, so how one thing influences another, and discovering those. There is also this assumption that among the researchers that work in this area, that cognitive process, how our brains work, and what we think about are independent from each other. So you could say that, people would agree that, yes, of course, we have different attitudes and beliefs and values and whatever, but the way that we process things is the same. So, for example, color perception or things like that, but actually that's not true. There are differences in how we perceive color and some very, very basic things as well. And then the biggest hurdle to changing any of this is that there are some huge practical challenges in doing cross-cultural research, because it's expensive, time-consuming, and difficult to publish, because academic journals like straightforward, clear stories, and you'll see very, very soon why that is difficult to achieve when you do cross-cultural research. So the ecosystem in academia makes it difficult because a lot of the research that we see is actually conducted and published by PhD students or young academics who need to publish a lot of stuff, a lot of material to make tenure for their careers, for career purposes. And if something takes time and money, they're really just less likely to do it. And about 10 years ago, when the paper was published, there was some momentum, but then around that time, the replication crisis became a big deal, and the focus of the academic field shifted to just checking, does this stuff that we think we know, is it actually true? What part of it is true? And it was less important or less important to look at the cultural side. So that's why we've ended up where we are. But, I don't actually know if I have this on, you might not see anything. So there was a blog that I used to run years ago called Indecision. And one of the interviews that we did was with Dan Ariely. And he actually said then that the biggest challenge for the field is for the next 10 years is to understand how much we can generalize from the findings that we have, and how well they sort of generalize over different contexts and so on. And that actually testing some of these theories and research and studying them and replicating them in different cultural contexts will give us a better idea of what is actually the underlying mechanism, and that we've been ignoring culture, which is really reassuring, at least from my perspective. The challenge comes from that behavior is always multiply determined. There are so many factors. But much of the research that we use and we look at and we talk about is the stuff on the right. So the characteristics of the decision itself, how you frame a choice or how you present options or priming and framing and so on. Those are things in the very immediate context of the choice or the behavior or so on. But then, or the decision. But then there's a whole lot of other stuff that is also relevant. So on the left, the very inner circle, so things like the limited attention, brain power, and sort of this myopia, short-sightedness psychologically, like we can't really think about things from other people's perspectives, or we can't project into the future. Those are also studied a fair bit, but then some of the, the time pressure and cognitive load and social context, those we have some research on. But the one in the middle, that's all emerging now, and there is not that much conclusive stuff. You have to kind of piece it together from different things. It's not just cultural context, it's socioeconomical background. There's new research that's come out in the past 5-10 years on how social class influences your decision making and how you behave. Identity, personality, also gender and age and so on. So all of that research is now emerging, but it's not cohesive yet. It's not coherent yet. And the reason all of this sort of, so to go back, they all interact because when we live in a particular society, there are different psychological processes that tell us how to behave. The fun diagram is sort of that at the bottom, you've got the individuals who have different interactions with each other. And then the interactions sort of build up to different institutions like schools or government departments and things like that. And then at the top, more abstract level, you have ideas that societies are built on. So for example, in the Netherlands, some of the ideas that you've gotten up to is like the individual the environment originally many years ago was not great for human habitation. There was a lot of basically a lot of the Netherlands has been dug out of the sea, and in order to do that, people had to work together. So there were a lot of interactions. They had to work together and make decisions in a sort of consensus basis, and just agree with each other and spend a lot of time thinking about things and planning and so on. That has led to certain types of institutions, like the political system is multiple parties, because that encourages that kind of consensus and taking a lot of viewpoints into account. And then that leads to ideas that run a society. So they're all sort of, and then it trickles down backwards and so it goes round and round and round. Some quick examples. There's some of the you can find some of this stuff, the references on Mind and Context, but some examples of things that we know that don't necessarily work, like aren't universal. Fundamental attribution error, which is basically it's not an error outside of the West necessarily. There isn't like a full catalog of where it does and doesn't appear, but at least a lot of the comparisons are between US and either China or Japan, because that's where the researchers were, and also they were searching for that kind of like maximal, the biggest possible difference to kind of see the effect or see if there is something. So fundamental attribution error is that we think that when someone does something, that like if I do something, I do it because it's my personality or it's about me. Whereas I can't remember exactly, I'll have to say just Asian, because I can't remember whether it was in China or Japan. I think it's it was China and US. People are more likely, not that it's black and white, more likely to think, but someone's behavior is determined by the context that they're in. So if you have newspaper articles, I think that at least one study was that if you have someone, there's been a, I think it was murder reports in newspapers in the US, they tend to describe the person and what they were like, and kind of sort of think that maybe they were evil or something like that. Not very scientific term. But if you had a similar story in that Asian context or Chinese context, it was more about this person has had a very stressful life or stressful conditions and so on. It was much less about the person. So may not be, that it may not exist everywhere else. There are different differences in risk preferences, but also not just one kind, but financial and social risks are different. People respond to authority differently depending on the cultural context, and even things like price quality heuristic are different, and like the strength, it differs per country. Now, really interesting recent example was this in a behavioral scientist. It was a really nice article, really cool intervention, and apparently I've taken a Pinterest board. I find dog training Pinterest board, great, didn't notice that. And this was done in Colombia, and I was quite surprised when I read it. I didn't see any mention that the intervention that they used works effectively, mainly because there is quite a high level of social cohesion, quite a lot of social pressure in those communities. So that already exists there, and they just leverage it. But the same type of intervention would probably not work in North America. But if you have time, that is a really interesting article to consider. there's also, I have couple of older examples, very popular, like very sort of common example to mention about in like entry-level example of interventions is from the behavioral insights team. So appealing to social norms to get people to pay their taxes. 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. You're in a very small minority who haven't paid us yet. But then the same thing doesn't, work elsewhere. In Guatemala, the approach that seemed effective was that the state is watching, and then also appealing to sort of national pride. That those things would not work in the UK as far as sort of I think about it. And then in Israel, they tried a totally different approach of actually threatening, and the moral appeals that they tried elsewhere did not work at all. So it could work. It can be quite different. You can't just copy paste interventions from one country to another. So this was I mentioned to Flávia that as I was working on this, I sort of thought of like, oh, maybe there is a way to kind of organize this to make it a bit easier for people. Oh, I can see that you've got questions. Can I come back to these? I will come back to these later.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you're familiar with the COMBI model, but it was designed by researchers or created by researchers at University College London, and it's sort of a meta organizing framework that for a behavior to happen, someone has to have the capability, opportunity, and motivation to do it. I'm not going to go into like deep into the theory, but it's a whole half-day session in itself. But let's see if we can, maybe we can get some thought starters. And those are really like the capability, and capability is people's psychological and physical abilities. Then you've got the social and physical environment that people are, interacting with. And then the sort of various influences that energize and direct behavior. So the reason I brought this up is that first of all, COMBI covers everything that you might think of as BE. This is not a comprehensive list, but I did this for a presentation recently or a client project, and just to show that actually it's a higher level organizing framework than just just looking at different biases. You can have this afterwards, so don't worry about this. It's just to kind of show that they kind of fall into different places. And so I started thinking, this is just sort of my organizing. So this is not official yet. This is my sort of draft thinking that how we could organize this and kind of represent what kinds of things we might want to consider. So capability splits into physical and psychological capability, and I've sort of grouped I've kind of added on the far right some factors and dimensions from cross-cultural psychology that we might want to consider, or how people might be different in different countries. There are actual neurological differences between that you can find between people in different cultural contexts. There are also cognitive differences in terms of perception and like visual illusions or color perception, language, of course, and then things like values, their sort of mindsets and schemas of the world. And then also attention process like autobiographical memory, what you code into long-term memory is influenced by cultural context. And these are, I think, the most sort of, most interesting things. Let's say that language, there is some emerging research by Keith Chen, I think he's at UCLA now, who did this, he's an economist, did an analysis that if you have a strong or weak future tense language, it influences things like saving rates and obesity figures and so on, because it influences how close psychologically the future feels. And then values is quite obvious. That's something that we're often aware of. So I'm not going to go into that very much, but that's obviously will influence our behavior. Then you've got, the opportunity, which is better, you could just think of it as environment. So even within countries, there'll be different aspects of the physical environment that influence people's behavior and their thinking. there are very sort of, clear different, like the documented differences between people who've grown up in or live in urban areas versus rural areas. The climate or the ecology of an area influences people's behavior, believe it or not. There are quite a few studies on this, for example, from Japan. So within one country, different climates in the north and the south. And then there's things like the material resource of the individual, so your social class and so on. There are specific social norms, religion, and then a couple of these two are quite useful things to if you want to read about. So tight versus loose cultures. It's a more recent. It's been around for about 10 years, maybe, or 6, 7, 8 years. But there was a book a couple of years ago by Michelle Gelfand, who's a lead researcher on that area, about social norms and how tight or loose they are in a society. So a book recommendation at the end, which you can take a look at. And then social orientation, which is a shorthand or a term for the psychological level of individualism and collectivism. So independent or interdependent social orientation and so on. So those are this is the area that Hazel Marcus, who you saw earlier, she's sort of pioneer in this area. Then you've got things like family models are different, gender equality, institutions, traditional, racial, all this kind of stuff influences people's behavior. And so some of this is like you might be thinking like, why are you talking about this? You'll see in a minute why I'm bringing all this up. Motivation is all the influences that basically drive people's behavior, like put energy into a sort of spark. You'll have the automatic, which includes emotions and reinforcement, and then the reflective, that you're able to tell someone, basically. Automatic is things that we're not aware of necessarily ourselves or can't analyze, and then reflective is more the things that we can easily talk about. And you'll have areas like emotions. Ideal affect is in a nutshell, it's what is a socially desirable level of energy in emotions. Is it high energy, like usually or predominantly American culture, North American culture prefers sort of high energy positive ideal affect, so very broad smiles and really sort of like, yeah, great, happy, super happy. Whereas let's say in Japan, it's much more calm, positive, or more neutral. So those things influence, emotions are not the same, or the things that people want to feel ideally are not the same. And also the words and the terms that we use for different emotion concepts are also culturally determined. Lisa Bellman Barrett's book, How Emotions Are Made, talks about that a lot. And then you have things like what people believe about their own capabilities. Self-confidence and self-esteem are something that varies quite a lot. It's very extreme end in the US, and then the rest of the world is like, we know a bit about some countries, but not others. And then lots of other things as well. The reason that I bring this up is that the answer to the question, like, well, we have this thing, this behavioral phenomena, how does it differ in some other country? And every time someone asks me that, it's like, well, it depends. It's a bit complicated. If the arrows seem a bit confusing and a bit annoying, that's because they are. It's relative. Things influence each other, and without considering quite a few things, it's difficult to give a clear answer, or like how would this differ in some other country. You can make an educated guess, depending on, there might be fewer arrows, if we focus on specific behaviors. But broadly speaking, I wanted to sort of illustrate that it's kind of like, it depends. There's a lot of connections and things influence each other. So for example, I'll give you an example of that so that it's not as abstract. Tight versus loose cultures, that is often influenced by the climate or the ecology. So countries that tend to have a history of a lot of natural disasters tend to have tighter social norms, because it's kind of easier to, like, that's a way to survive in a more unpredictable environment. And then conversely, countries that have not had any physical, like, sort of environmental threats or wars and things like that, they tend to be looser. So there's it kind of, yeah, it's multiply determined. Now there's often that, so actually I'll go back a little bit. So the problem is that we know a fair bit. What we know a fair bit, but not terribly, not everything about cultural differences. But much of the research that exists is on a east-west axis, and when we say west, it's on US Eastern Asia axes. And there is a little bit of research coming out of Latin America, but not very much. And Africa is entirely sort of, it's just a blank in the literature. So it's there's a lot of work to be done. Now the next slide is like, I recently saw a talk in this sort of academic seminar online. And this paper is not out yet. It's in process of being published, so I can't share tons about it. And I received it recently, so I wanted to just add a couple of things to show that actually Latin America is very different. Like, people often think that, oh, Latin America is collectivistic. New research suggests that maybe not quite so. That these are some of the charts from his presentation. So you'll have the cultural tightness is much, you can see at the bottom, much higher in Confucian Asia versus Latin America, according to his research. Things like indulgence is totally different as well, and positive emotions, there was a lot more in his presentation. But just to give you an idea that this is new research that's coming out, I can actually send the reference after that. I should have put it here. When it comes out, you can look it up. But so it's not as straightforward as, individualistic, collectivistic, and, all of Latin America is somehow collectivistic. So how do we solve this? Which is an excellent question. A bit too much maybe for just me to answer, but I have some thoughts that might help, or what I think should probably happen. I think there should be more consideration from scientists on how far their results will generalize. For example, being clearer that your research is not about people, it's being specific what cultural context they're from and to whom they might generalize and why. But the problem is that psychology has a bit of a theory problem. There is very little sort of cumulative theory that puts these pieces together, and the incentives are much more like just publish and find some new things and just churn it out. So that makes things difficult, and I don't think we'll see that for many years. But maybe we could use something like Combi. That's just my speculation. It's not from any paper. And the other thing is that what we don't have in psychology is theoretical psychologists. Economics has theoretical economists, and other scientific fields have people who just focus on theory, but that's not really a big thing. It's not really a thing in psychology. Maybe it should be there. But as practitioners, I think the most important thing is to be aware that what surrounds us, it's only normal because it's what we know, and it's not necessarily normal elsewhere, and really sort of challenge our assumptions, like, why do we think this works here, and why does it work why might it work somewhere else? And so just a couple of final thoughts. What I'd like you to sort of take away from all of this talk is that we all have these sort of mental models that give us assumptions about people we interact with and situations that we face and how we perceive the world ultimately. And a lot of the principles of decision making and behavior are sort of universal, but cultural context sort of can dial them up or down a bit, like a volume button in a stereo or something. And cross-cultural research in psychology is not just to sort of make it more representative and sort of more of a for a sort of principle, for a general principle that we should have research on people from different contexts, but it can also help us understand why why something works somewhere, why it doesn't work somewhere else. If a particular phenomena exists or intervention works here but it doesn't work there, then it's not a failure. It's an interesting. It's like we should be asking why. Well, why did it work there, but why did it not work there? But that's there's much less of that at the moment. And if we want to do behavior change effectively and efficiently in different cultural contexts, we need to be aware of all the types of factors that could influence decision making, and keep those in mind. And really, it means doing a lot of research and research or literature review for yourself, and really contextualizing and localizing it. That's pretty much it. There's also a list of books that I've recommended, sort of nice, around the world in 7 books. I've mentioned some of them. Lisa Feldman-Barrett's book is excellent. It's not about culture, but a lot of stuff at the end is really relevant, and she talks about it a lot. Some of these are a bit older, like Geography of Thought is quite old now, but it's still a decent introduction. If I was to pick some, I would probably pick Clash, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, and How Emotions Are Made. If you were going to pick a couple, there are more. Rule Makers is Michelle Gelfand's book is probably the most, like that, and Clash are the most practical, accessible, easiest to read. How Emotions Are Made there's a lot of stuff, and Joseph Henrich's books are very dense. They're probably twice the density and length than the other ones. So yeah, I would recommend those. And if you want to read some other things, there's also stuff on Mind in Context, and there will be more. The goal for Mind in Context is kind of to have this type of stuff in one place, so to at least help practitioners to find it more easily. That's it, really. Shall I stop? I'll stop sharing. And there's questions.
Well, thank you so much, Elina.
You're welcome.
Great talk. Very, very, very energizing. I'll start with one of questions that I had sort of pre-prepared. Reading your material is a question about the issue of class.
Mm-hmm.
So, a dimension of cultural and context specificity is just the difference between classes, even within a given country or a given society. Or, for instance, I come from Rio, which is a very unequal city, really. Mm-hmm. With when you consider it, you have very different contexts within a few miles from each community. So, and it seems that beyond the weirdness in the discussion on weird, behavioral science comes from scientists. Mm-hmm. More often than not, they come from a position of privilege.
Yeah.
So, how mature, in your view, is the field to address those issues?
Not very. I'm not sorry to be quite blunt. I think it's quite difficult to sort of address that. It's if you look at the top researchers whose work we tend to read and refer to, they are usually in a very prestigious university in America. And what you might not always think that it's not a very straightforward merit system. I know a lot of people who are PhD students and then now assistant professors. You have to have a certain trajectory. You have like a degree in an Ivy League university is ridiculously expensive. You have to come from a very good background. It's very unusual that you'd have a top scientist in our field who doesn't come from a privileged background. Like there is no way, there's very small chance that you'd end up in Harvard or somewhere else if you don't come from that kind of background. So there's already a big problem that you can't play the game, can't play the game. It's very, very difficult to play the game that way. It's also not very sexy for your career to study that kind of stuff. it doesn't sell books, does it? Like it's much easier to sell a book, like do a TED talk on power poses, or how get consultancy gigs if you do something that's much more commercial. Talking about how there are some people, obviously, like Eldar Shafir and Sandil Manathan, who talked about scarcity, but that's just one part of it. That's just one part of the puzzle. So I think that research is still, we'll be waiting for that for a while, or you have to piece it together from lots of different sources and actually look outside our field and then make educated guesses from literature over here on social psychology of poverty or inequality, and then try to match it with the what you might think of as decision-making literature. That's where we are, is that it's a lot of work to match that, and these worlds don't connect very much yet. So yeah, it's not very optimistic, but there are some things that you can you can look into as a starting point to help kind of think around that. Hazel Marcus' book Clash is a good starting point. She, after I think the last 10 years of her past 10 years of her career, she's really focused on inequality. So there are other books that she's written after that look at that as well. And so she's done studies that are about inequality in America and how the psychology of that. Then there's also Krishna Savani has some interesting things, and also Michelle Gelfand's book is a good starting point, sort of an introduction to that kind of that if you are from a sort of upper versus lower class, middle class tends to be more let's call it individualistic for shorthand for the conversation. We tend to be more or less connected to others around us, relatively speaking, than those from a lower class, because it's kind of like we're more self-sufficient. University makes us more that way as well. So I think those books are very good for a starting point, and they're good reads as well. So yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was a long answer.
A great one though.
Yeah.
Hopefully it helps. Hopefully it helps.
We love long answers. Elina, once again, thanks for your talk. It was great. I have a question about how we perceive and how we actually read and see about the difference between individual decision-making and group decision-making. When we research the literature and even in practice, we can see some difference between these two universes, like two completely different animals. But I think that one may argue that these differences comes from our weirdness, because Western countries tend to have more of an individualistic culture. Do you think if we go to Eastern cultures, more collectivist cultures, we may find these same differences, or this gap should be smaller between individual decision-making and group decision-making?
So I think it's definitely smaller. So there's some interesting research, for example, by Sharon Shabit. I will actually, when I listen to the next question, I'll look it up. It's the paper is called "Preferences Need Not Be Personal," and she in that paper she talks about how we tend to think of people's preferences as something that is an individual. That's also how the judgment decision-making literature is set up. It's all about individual decisions, and then social influences on decisions is something external. It's like an external influence that comes in separate. And if we are influenced by other people's decisions or other people, we're sort of a doormat. It's like, it's not a good thing to be influenced by other people. But that's not really, that's just our way of thinking. I have a story, sort of a personal anecdote about this. I went on holiday many years ago with a Japanese friend, and I asked her what she wanted to do that day, and she said she was a cross-cultural psychologist, so she knew, hence the strange answer. She said, do you know what, Elina? It's really weird. I don't know what I want to do before I know what you want to do. And I know why that is, because Japanese culture is very normal, or is very sort of intuitive to take other people's views and preferences into consideration, but you don't do it consciously. You just sort of know. You sort of absorb other people's, what they want to do, what they like. We don't. I don't. I have no, like, I have to consciously do it. And I knew the theory, and it's been probably 10 years or something, and I still think, like, I know it rationally, but I can't imagine what that's like. Like, how do you not know what you want? Because we're like, I'm not American, but I think so. Finland's less pronounced, but usually in many Western countries, we tend to raise kids from the beginning by asking them, what do you want? What would you like to do? And it's all about, we're taught to develop individual likes and preferences and opinions about a lot of things. What do we think? And that's not that process is different. It's more about, you need to pay attention to social harmony rather than what you want. So it's very difficult to switch to something else. Anyway, so I think the long story round, I think the difference between what the social norms are, they're sort of integrated in what you want in more I want to say many Eastern contexts, cultural contexts, because I don't want to be sort of stereotyping here, but broadly speaking, they are more, the overlap sort of Venn diagram is like this, whereas we're much more like this. It's one influence among many. That's as far as I know so far.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great.
You found the paper. Very good. Good. I'm glad you Googled it. That's a really interesting one, which has gone entirely unnoticed by any of the behavioral science literature, which is hopefully I need to do a lot of work to sort of reference articles like that on Mind in Context. But yeah, it's more of a project than anything else. I think there was a question as well. Did I miss one? Or you had a lot. You probably had other questions as well.
Thanks a lot, Elina. It was fantastic, the talk. We did write some questions, but I think it was a lot food for thought. So we were thinking here a lot to discuss further too. And one question that I want to make, so we are going to do 2 more questions or 3, and then we will open for the questions in the chat. So we usually do that. Fine. And I wanted to hear a little bit about, you didn't mention, and I can imagine a little your answer, but about behavioral science units. Do you believe that the behavioral science units that have been created around the world have contributed for this producing evidence out of the lab and adapting to the cultural context and the replication studies? Yeah. Or how can we do more to understand, the nuances of cultural influences in behavioral change? So let's hear a bit about it.
So the behavioral science units, this is just a gut feeling, but I think they are building or creating an evidence base or library of evidence that will be useful, but the findings are just as fragmented as the literature itself is. I haven't seen a lot of discussion or analysis or references to using kind of any frameworks or a lot of theories or frameworks from cross-cultural psychology or cultural psychology. They're slightly different things. And even if you look at the OECD report that came out a couple of years ago that has a lot of those findings catalogued, you'd have to go through all 400 pages. It's on my list to go through that and kind of see what I can find, but sadly it's quite a big task. I've been wanting for a while to see what you can conclude from that. But the problem is that because if you don't measure some of those variables, you're just guessing. If you don't measure, if you don't theorize in advance, you didn't measure it, so you can't prove it. It's not really evidence, it's just guesses. So yes, they are creating this library of data and evidence that we can maybe use in the future. But I think the problem is that just being from a particular culture or having grown up in it doesn't make you an expert in it. So it's not an answer like, it's not a straightforward answer that, we need to understand that. I don't know, how should I say this? The fact that I'm Finnish doesn't make me an expert in Finnish decision making. Not at all. If I hadn't studied or looked at and kind of read about theories and frameworks, I would not be able to tell you how something is different, because some of the stuff is just normal to me. So I can't translate. I will leave stuff out. I can't see the patterns because I don't have the words and frameworks. Just like 10 years ago, a lot of us, we didn't have this language of looking at different behavioral phenomena. It's exactly the same thing, but we can't see the patterns and the systematic differences or similarities even if we don't have the terminology. So I think what they should be doing more, what we should be doing, I don't know, maybe they're doing it but not documenting it. Really start to engage with cross-cultural psychologists more and kind of talking about that and respect it, kind of bringing that in. And sort of as a practitioner, what I tend to do and what I would sort of, if anyone asks for like a tip or advice, I would say always ask, when you read something, would this work in my country? Can I imagine this example working, this intervention working where I'm from? If not, why? Why not? And that will give you some, like, it's always be critical. Like, does this work here? And then start thinking about why might not work, what might work instead. And then keeping an open mind every time you see something. What is the mechanism, unlikely mechanism underneath? Even if it's not tested specifically in the study, it's useful to kind of speculate and then test, because all we can do is that there is no encyclopedia or catalog to pull, like, we need to do sustainability behavior change in Guatemala. Let's pull it out from a hat. Like, no, it doesn't exist. Let's give it 50 years, maybe we do. But there isn't even theory about that, because a lot of countries are, like, most countries are understudied. So we need to make educated guesses and then test. So maybe one day. I'm such a pessimist.
There are so many experiences that didn't work, like, and also like this OSD, IDB Invest, World Bank, we have Ju, but now they're having more like feet on the ground. Yes, behavior studies, they are so important for that. So we can see that this year, for example, it grew like immensely, the idea that we need people in the field.
Yeah, definitely.
Hopefully. So next question, I think Juliana will make.
Yeah. So Elina, thanks again. I mean, this response, the last response is really rich and, I mean, fit to the, foot on the ground. You're pessimistic, but this is the reality. I'd like to do a little follow-up on that. I mean, I work with the Embed group in the World Bank, and it's a very multidisciplinary, first of all, but also multicultural. And they do a lot of field work. I mean, not now, but used to actually put the feet on the ground and go to the field to look at. And most of their work is based on a good definition of problems and also good diagnostics.
Yeah.
So I hear you that we as behavioral scientists need to involve more multicultural psychologists on the studies in general. But what's your opinion about this diagnostic work, the actual quali and quanti profound field work before actually testing or replicating a work? Do you think it's enough? If not, what else could we do?
Well, no, I think it. Oh God, I give yes and no answers to everything. Sorry, I'll say the yes first. It's really good to do that, because the qualitative helps us to sort of like the descriptive and kind of get the language that people are using about various behaviors or how they think about it. So I'm a researcher. I'm sort of qualitative and quantitative researcher in a commercial sector. That's my background. So I would always say, yes, do more research, do research. Don't like it's blown my mind for years that people suggested doing interventions, just like, let's just do that. That works. Like, yeah, just pick something from the air. It's probably this. Let's give it a try. I'm like, what? Why don't you research the barriers first? Like, of course you start from what's the problem, then solve it. But I just thought maybe it was just me. But no, times are changing. I think descriptive work is very important because we're usually never the target audience. We're usually never the target audience of the intervention. And I've written about this before. Even as behavior change practitioners, we are a very privileged, weird with a small W, weird group of people. Really, like hardly anyone gets into this field without having a university degree, sometimes like multiple. And, we're probably by definition quite often sort of middle class and, all that kind of stuff. We have a very different mindset to the people whose behavior we're trying to change. So always, unless you're very sure, do some piloting, at least, and pilot qualitative. Quant is very useful for refining and kind of testing your hypothesis. So if qualitative, let's say in qualitative, you've identified a range of barriers. Let's say you had 20 hypotheses and 10 of them seem more of a likely issue. And then you can put those into the quantitative research and then actually quantify to whom is this a problem, the big problem, which ones, like prioritizing the barriers that you're going to solve. So I think for that reason, quant is very useful, that you can look at how many people does it affect, who does it affect, because barriers are never a unit, hardly ever is like one thing is going to solve, one intervention is going to solve everything. Nah, it's a this will help these people, maybe a combination of this two will help those, and so on. And you need to work out which ones you're going to prioritize. So I think they're very, very important. Is that enough? Research is, garbage in, garbage out. So, if you haven't done proper scoping exercise, literature review, hypotheses before you even start the qual, then you may miss out a lot of things. So, if you haven't put it in at the beginning to explore, to even like check it out or check your own prejudice, whatever, it will not be there in the quant. It will not be there. You'll miss it. So it is enough, but at the same time, it depends. It depends who's doing it. So that's, yeah. I should maybe add that some people who applied behavioral science practitioners don't rate qualitative research very much. It's all about experiments, and I'm like, I don't know. I think they are very valuable, and there are some academics. There's someone on the Just a Bunch of BS podcast. He was Michael Inslicht. He's a social psychologist, and he talks about how maybe social psychology ran into experiments a little bit too quickly and should have kept his options open about research and like methods, and maybe doing some more qualitative and descriptive stuff would have been, useful before doing experiments. But here we are. So I really recommend that podcast episode because he talks about it, and there are some links in the show notes and so on as well. So I recommend that as if you're interested in like the method battle.
Perfect, thank you. Now we're gonna take some questions from our chat. I'll take Vera first. Vera, would you like to open your video or your microphone?
Okay, thank you. That was an excellent talk. Thanks a lot. These are issues that I believe all of us have been wondering about for so long. And I'm going to ask you a question that my students always ask me, and I tend to give a lame answer like, well, Kahneman says that, yes, they stand across cultures. But myself, I'm always kind of doubtful about it because we just don't know enough about Eastern cultures or African cultures and all that. But anyway,
let alone Latin American.
Well, we're here, we know a little bit. So, yeah. But yes, definitely there are differences. So I'd like to ask you if there is research on the very well-known, the famous biases, those by Kahneman and Tversky. Do they hold across cultures? Is there anything about it? Do they show up the same way? Framing effects, loss aversion, mental accounting, things like that?
So those are by slightly like some of them are by different researchers. I can't remember exactly whom, but like I just want to check. Do you mean prospect theory? I don't know exactly if prospect theory has been sort of explored, but things like framing effects are theoretically should be stronger in Eastern. Don't quote me on this, like Eastern cultures, because of sort of more holistic processing style and taking more of the contextual cues into account. So they should be even stronger than they are in Western context. So Sharon Shavit actually also has a paper on the price quality heuristic and how that effect is stronger in in Eastern contexts. So some, but not. It's not like there's not like a catalog that you can just go and look into it. There is more. There are some references in the articles on Mind in Context, but I have some more. So if you send an email, I can look up. I have a PDF folder of lots of stuff. I can see what I have, but you have to remind me. So I'll put my email here. So remember to email me, and I will see what I have, and if I can help you on that, get started with that.
Thanks a lot. That'll be great.
But yeah, it does exist. It does. There definitely exists. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Elina, I'll take another question from chat. It's from Melissa. She says that there are studies of social psychology that consider the normative perspective of human motivation, such as legitimacy, as in laws and morality, more important than the instrumental perspective, like punishments and prizes. So in your analysis of motivation, and of course in cross-cultural contexts, how do you classify legitimacy and morality in these contexts?
I don't actually know what legitimacy means here.
Like law systems, I believe. Melissa, please correct me if I'm wrong. But different countries, different cultures work with different law systems.
So that would probably be so something like, actually the combi system doesn't actually take those into account, because it's meant to be about behavior. I would say that it's probably like laws would influence through social norms and things like that, so trickle down. That's more of a macro context kind of thing. It would probably be in the physical opportunity. If something's not legal, then you can't do it. Morality, to be honest, I don't know a lot about morality. Would be related to social norms, probably religion and things like that. But I'm not very well versed in that area. But if you are interested in morality and the development of that, I would look up Joseph Hendrick's book, that The Weirdest People in the World. He talks in that book how basically the Catholic Church is a big factor in sort of how the world became weird, basically. But there are, if you don't want to read the whole book, there are now, I don't know, dozens of articles summarizing the book, because his publisher has probably made him do a ton of them, and there are podcasts and whatnot. So if you just look him up and find the one that seems most fun to read, then there will be lots on that at the moment.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great, Elina. I mean, we are approaching the end of it. It's past midnight for you, but I would like for you to, if you can just explain a little bit to us, or just introduce to us your new project of the Behavior Change Society. Seems quite exciting for us practitioners.
Yeah, sure. So hold on, I will just get this episode before, because Flávia asked for that. Let me just get that very quickly. I will start talking as I'm doing that.
Oh, sorry, but we can forward everyone later. Sorry, Lina.
No, it's here. It's here. I know very well. I've recently looked for it, so it's.
I read some article that that is actually impossible to multitask, but I mean, you can prove me wrong.
It depends. It depends how fluent some of the tasks are. So,
okay.
I think it depends. I also have an ADHD mind, so I probably have multiple processes, whether I want to or not. It certainly feels that way. So Behavior Change Society, yes. So I realized a little last year that that it would be great if we had some way of sharing the knowledge and kind of sharing the knowledge of behavioral science practitioners more flexibly than just like someone doing a physical workshop or a course. And a lot of people who I know are brilliant practitioners, very experienced, they are so busy, they wouldn't take the time to actually create an online course or something like that because they've got stuff to do. And so I took, the inspiration came actually from dog training. I do a lot of dog training, dog sports, and there is an American dog school, and it's like the behavioral science equivalent, but just dogs. So specialists who are in very ranging areas geographically, but you can access their knowledge in a central place. And so Behavior Change Society, the idea is that it's a platform that helps and facilitates behavioral science practitioners to create courses and share their knowledge. And you can learn from practitioners around the world, wherever you are, because there is a big accessibility issue as well, that a lot of them are based in America or North America or Europe, and it's actually really difficult to access some of those if you're on the other side of the world. It's beyond capacity of expensive to fly somewhere and do that. So not only is it sort of helping people share their knowledge, and they're all very enthusiastic about like, yes, this would be great to do this, but also allows us to sort of supercharge the next generation of behavior change practitioners and share that knowledge. And because it's a platform, we'll have some economies of scale in doing things like subtitles. So you can, if you're an individual practitioner, you can't, it's just too much hassle to do, let's say, translations of subtitles into Portuguese or Spanish or whatever. But if you have a platform like that, then it starts to make more sense. And also, if you are a practitioner somewhere in Latin America, which is a huge continent, it would be very difficult to access the knowledge from someone who lives in Argentina if you are, or in Mexico, and vice versa. It's just practically impossible. So it's always a work in progress, but I think in the future it would be the idea is, as soon as I find people who are interested, to have practitioners from outside the weird world to give courses as well. And it's meant to be it has elements of peer review process, so everyone who is on the platform, they have some say over who, like looking at whether the next person who wants to do a course, whether they know what they're talking about. And they also give each other feedback on their courses. So there's a little bit of peer review elements as well to kind of add that quality and sort of more community and that kind of thing. So that's kind of the idea. And yeah, it was sort of, I waited a long time to move forward with it. I thought, is this really what I want to do? And I thought it should exist. So I guess I'm doing it now, And so yeah, will move at the speed that people are ready to do stuff. But yeah, if you want to talk about it more, then you know where to find me. And I think it would be really good to have some content translated as well. So yeah, it doesn't all have to be in English. I might sound British, but I am actually quite critical of the Anglo-Saxon world, as you may see sometimes if you follow me. Poor Scottish husband sometimes, but you know, he knows what he got into. So yeah, it doesn't all have to be Anglo-Saxon. I really I should have maybe mentioned that I have a soft spot for Latin America. I haven't been to Brazil, but I've traveled maybe altogether like 6 months around like Mexico and in different bits, not like backpacking, but a month in Argentina and Nicaragua and yeah, all around, yeah, well, more Central American countries as well, and Peru. So I am, yeah, I have a soft spot, I think, but I haven't made it to Brazil, and at this rate, we're never ever traveling ever anywhere again. So
certainly not to here.
At this rate, it's like can't even go to Germany or Belgium. So like.
Hopefully soon, next year, Elina. It will be a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah,
for
yeah,
sure.
yeah, yeah. We're never traveling ever. So gonna have to read it from books. Yeah.
Great. But let's keep in touch. Maybe we can have your insights in the culture part here in Brazil.
Yeah, and I would really like to sort of ask you that if you want to write about something that's to do with behavior change and culture, like cultural, from a different cultural perspective, Mind in Context is meant to be a place to publish lots of people's perspectives. At the moment, it's mostly mine because I'm still trying to persuade lots of people to write. And so it looks like it's like my personal blog. It's not meant to be that way. The idea is that we can start to have a place to collect these experiences and stories, and so that in 5 years' time we have a place to start from. At least it's not scattered everywhere. So, but we'll get there. So thank you very much for inviting me. It was fun. So
yeah, let's do more times. We asked everyone to put the video just to have a photo, if you don't mind. And se o pessoal quiser abrir vídeo aí para tirar, né, Ju? E aí você encerra. Vamos ver quem pode aí. Let's see, have this moment registered. Pessoal, vou tirar agora então. 3 e 2, 3 e. And Elina, just so you know, we have a lot of practitioners here that are key references the area, like Vera, Clare. So Clare works a lot in public policy area of the National School of Administration in English, yeah. So I think many people that you can chat later also.
Just an additional incentive for you to come to Brazil, Elina. Brazil has, multiple countries within itself, So talk about cross-cultural. Come to Brazil and you'll find out.
Yep, I definitely, that is on my list, or was on my list before any of this happened. So yeah, I will think about that once we can travel again. So thank you. And yeah, have a lovely evening. I'm going to go to sleep. I'm going to go to sleep now. So, but yeah, it's okay. I'm an evening person, so yeah. And
I'm sorry, there was a.
Oh no, don't worry. I'm an evening person. It's fine. And I will send you the slides so you can put them somewhere if you want. So, or you have them on a video. But anyway.
No, it would be nice. It would be amazing. We can read in details.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Elina, for having foi gravado. Thank you very much for being with us. Let's keep in touch. I don't know if Juliana has a few last words, but thanks a lot. And yeah, for being till midnight here with everyone here.
It's okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. Boa noite, pessoal.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Elina. Thank you so much. Obrigado, pessoal.
Todo mundo. Jane.
Thank you.
Tchau. Thank you.
Obrigado.
Bye-bye.
Pessoal, para quem ficou já anunciando o próximo Meetup vai ser da próxima. A gente vai trazer, também vai ser internacional. A gente vai trazer a Kate Lafan do University College de Dublin. Ela vai estar falando de ciência comportamental aplicada a tornar organizações mais sustentáveis. Eu convivi com ela, ela era, na verdade, estudante de PhD quando eu estava fazendo meu mestrado. Ela também tem uma pesquisa extensa em bem-estar subjetivo. Como ela está com um filho pequeno, então, ao contrário da Elina, ela não pode fazer na alta madrugada dela. A gente combinou de fazer no feriado do dia 21 de abril, que vai ser uma quarta-feira, e para ir viabilizar a gente fazer um pouco mais cedo, então vai ser às 4 horas do dia 21 de abril, no feriadão. Vamos testar um horário e formato novo, mas vai ser uma conversa bem legal. Assim, ela é super, super carismática e tem uma pesquisa muito legal. Combinado?
E aproveito até para falar, fiquem em casa. A salvo, então, dia 21 de abril, às 4 da tarde, em casa.
É a nossa contribuição para que as pessoas fiquem em casa.
Não é? Adorei.
Como que eu consigo o link? Porque eu achei que era o horário normal de 7h30, mas tem o fuso, né? Daí, lógico que não dava para ser.
A gente publica no YouTube. A gente publica no YouTube até o final da semana e a gente manda o link. Você está nos grupos, Márcia?
Tô.
Então você vai receber por lá.
E aí, se inscrevendo no próximo, a gente já faz a marcação pro dia 21, no horário certo. Então.
Porque o e-mail acho que não veio com horário, aí eu assumi que era o horário normal, 7h30, e nem me toquei de fuso, nada, e aí entrei no final, né, tipo, não deu para pegar nada.
Foi muito legal, não, vai ser... a gente
não, e é minha área, né, é super minha área, então eu quero assistir, ainda bem que foi gravada, menos mal.
Sempre é.
Sempre é. Pessoal, gente, obrigada, viu?
Beijo.
Obrigado a todos.
Beijo, tia Vera. Saudade. Tchau, Flávia. Tchau,
obrigado.
Obrigada.
Obrigada. Bom ver vocês.
Obrigado, Vera.
Obrigada.